All right, we've got Molly Krause and Nancy Anderson and Barbara Tibbs to thank for helping in Children's last week. So thank you, deeply appreciate that. And yesterday we were not able to see the children's craft because the macaroni was too wet to put. She was dyeing the macaroni to make friendship necklaces, so they were too wet for us to see. So I think the children will have fun with that today. And the aim is to teach that Jesus wants to spend time with them just as he spent time with the two men who were walking to Emmaus. So praise the Lord for the children's teachers. Appreciate them very, very much. Paul is trying to tell us to take off and put on. So I'd like to introduce maybe some of the younger gals to this individual called Nicky Cruz. Nicky Cruz was born in Puerto Rico. His mother was a witch, and his father was a satanic priest. He was a victim of repeated physical abuse, and eventually his parents rejected him. They sent him to New York to live with his brother, Frank. And he became immediately involved in gangs, the notorious gang they're called the Mau Maus, and went up in ranks right away. Shortly after Cruz became the gang leader, an evangelist by the name of Dave Wilkerson was preaching in the neighborhood. And he encountered Cruz, and he told Cruz that Jesus loved him and he would never stop loving him. And Cruz responded by slapping Wilkerson in the face and said, "I'll kill you." Wilkerson attempted again later on to convert Cruz and received the same treatment. So, being persistent, Dave Wilkerson hired a bus, and he had an outreach, and he invited the gang members to get on this bus and come to his outreach, which they did. And Nicky Cruz said as soon as he entered that arena, he was convicted of the sins that he had done and began to feel remorse. Well, of course, there was a collection, and Cruz made his gang get up, and I can just see him, forcing people to give money. So they gave money, and when they went to the back of the stage, there was an exit. And he had to convince his gang to give that money to Dave Wilkerson instead of going out the exit. Later in that outreach, Cruz and his gang responded to the altar call, and he became a believer. Talk about transformation. They took the gang to the police station right after this. They took their guns, their knives, their bricks, and they turned them in. The police said that if they would have seen them coming, they would have shot them. I mean, they were notorious. Cruz went on to evangelize other group members and the next leader of the Mau Maus. He has written several books. Some of us oldies by goodies remember Pat Boone being in The Cross and the Switchblade. And then he's written other books and still in ministry. I mean, to me, it was just such a put off and put on by the grace of God. And Paul is trying to teach that to us, and he's trying to teach that to the Gentiles. And so our central idea today is how do we live this new transformed life? And he puts it into, first of all, looking at the stages of depravity. And there's 4 of them, and they're up here for you, and then I'm going to take each one of them and try to talk about each stage. So, obstinacy, okay? And we're going to use Romans. You used Romans in your text, and we'll study that too today. So Romans 1, verses 18, 21, and 28. First of all, if you're going to be obstinate, you are going to suppress truth, Romans 18. 21, they knew God, but neither did they glorify him or give thanks to him. 28, they did not think it worthy to obtain the knowledge of God. And Ephesians 4:18 says that led to hardening of their hearts. So what is it about darkness that people miss what God is all surrounding them, the light that he offers? Why does it not speak to them? Well, Paul says it's because they harden their hearts, and he uses a Greek word, P-O-R-O-S-I-S, and it was a kind of marble, or in the medical writers, a calloused or a bony formation around the joints. Hence the verb meant to petrify, to become hardened and therefore insensitive, and it's often translated blindness. And that was after a study of the 8 New Testament references that it ended up being interpreted a little better, meaning blindness than hardness. So pagan immorality is seen as willful and culpable, and it's a result of a deliberate refusal of the moral light that God has given us. So in this hardness of the heart, the darkness of the mind, the deadness of the soul, and then comes judgment. And finally, there's this reckless life. So let's look at judgment. It just says that God gave them over, and it's repeated in verse 24, 26, and 28 of 1 Romans. Just gave them over. And then in Ephesians 4:18, it states that because of that, they were just separated from God. So this separation, this giving over just causes extreme recklessness. And in Romans 24, it talks about great impurity. Then there's shameful lust. There's shameless acts. And 28, to do what ought not to be done, kind of covers a whole bunch, and every kind of wickedness. So in Ephesians 4:19, you just lose all sensitivity to what God is asking, what he's given, the grace you have, and it's just a complete downward spiral. So then Paul says, well, what does this new life look like? And Nikki Cruz sure gave us a viewpoint on that one. He says, really, Paul is trying to teach us a moral education. He wants to teach his Gentiles. He urges them, because they're new believers, 1, to learn what they should know. 2, to really listen, to hear what God is telling them. And then 3, to be taught, the softening of the heart, to be taught what Jesus has for them. And so this truth, if this hardness of heart leads to recklessness, what is it about truth that sets Christians so free and leads them to righteousness? Well, it's a way of life that they've learned as a new creation. It's only possible because of that. It is a result of a radical conversion physically, and then a recreation of our divine side. It involves rejection of the old, former self. And I don't know about you ladies, but I grew up in a house where swearing happened all the time. I can't tell you the bad names I was called, because culturally, that was just accepted. We were in a family that went to church every Sunday, but man, that language was terrible. And it has taken a long time to go from those old tapes of what was said and what was called to the new one that Christ wants us to think and speak. So it is a process, and Paul knew that. You don't just overnight become this perfect Christian. In fact, you never become that. So he is just trying to teach. And he says in the examples that we're going to look at that every one of them concerns relationships. Holiness is not accomplished or happens in a vacuum. It's in relationships. And he gives examples of negatives and the positive things that you need to do. And then he gives us reasons for why we're to do it, or there is implications of that. Interestingly enough, he talks about lying first, and I was very curious about that. But the commentators point out that the first lie that they gave up as Gentiles was paganism. And so Paul is continuing them to complete that walk of holiness by not lying about anything, by being extremely truthful, to denounce it, because that paganism, that lie, was the chief symptom of their feudal, dark minds. So not to even venture into the smallest lie to speak the truth. And then he talks about temper and the righteous anger. And there's two kinds, righteous and unrighteous. And we know there has to be a righteous anger because God and Jesus were angry. And as Christians, it is our job to look at, and especially our motives and our speech when anger is aroused within us, and what does Scripture say for us not to sin. And I thought stealing was very interesting. I always thought you shouldn't steal because that